Let us now continue with the topic and see it in more detail. Starting with the long-term causes, and the first one we have is the political causes behind the War of Independence 1857. Now the political causes include 3 pointers over here. Annexations between 1750s and 1850s done by the East India Company to capture the Indian territories. The second one, doctrine of lapse, and the third one, misgovernment. So what do we mean by these annexations? From 1750s onwards until 1850s, the British East India Company went on with the annexation policy. They fought many battles, starting with the Battle of Plassey, then the Battle of Buxar, then the annexation of Mysore, annexation of Delhi or entering into Delhi, fighting with the Marathas, fighting with the Sikhs, annexation of Sindh and Punjab. These battles actually resulted in the feelings of hatred being generated in the hearts of the Indians. And the Indians disliked that these foreigners are actually taking over their lands. And so those people, those governments, those local governments who had lost their power to the British EIC later on were up front against the EIC in the War of Independence 1857. The second one is doctrine of lapse. In 1850s, the Governor General of the British East India Company was Lord Dalhousie, and he came up with another policy. And that policy was that if in any state the ruler does not have a male heir, then the British would confiscate the property after the death of that ruler. It means that if in any state the ruler has a daughter, then the daughter would not be allowed to inherit the property of her father. For example, if in any state the ruler does not have a direct male heir, he has an adopted son, then that adopted son would also not be able to inherit the property of the father. Because of this doctrine of lapse, there were many states who lost power to the British East India Company, and so they were also taking part in the War of Independence 1857. Then we have misgovernment. The British East India Company came up with another policy, and that was, if in any state the British East India Company saw that the ruler is not doing governance properly, then the British would confiscate that piece of land as well, and hence many of those areas were lost to the British East India Company because of misgovernment. The Indian political class disliked all of these policies and hence took part in War of Independence 1857. Moving onwards, we have some of the social reasons behind the War of Independence 1857, starting with the language issue. During the time of the Mughal Empire, the official language of the administration used to be Persian. And then after a while, Urdu became the official language of the administration. But when East India Company started to gain control over India, by 1830s, they were able to replace Urdu by English as the first official language, and Urdu became the second official language of India. So what was happening actually because of this? Because of this, just imagine that the popular language of India would be Urdu. The Indian people do not know this language, that is English. So if I say that at the first level of administration, the language used would be English, do you think that the Indians would be able to get employment opportunities over here? No. Indians would naturally now be confined to only this second level of administration. Moving onwards, there was another problem, the social problem. that was being done in India, and that was the insult of local culture. So when the British came to India and started to gain superiority, the political superiority over the Indians, soon their mindsets also changed. Now they believed that their race, the English race, the British people, the Christian people were more superior than the Indian people. And because of this concept of superiority and inferiority, the British started to mock the culture of the Indians. Even the officials of the British East India Company did not shy away from talking against the culture of the Indians. There was a person known as Thomas Macaulay, and Thomas Macaulay is reported to have said that one good shelf of the Britain's library is way better than all of the literature of Arab and India combined. Such remarks actually hurt the feelings of the people, and eventually this led to an uprising in India, what we know as the Revolt of 1857 or the War of Independence 1857. Moreover, the British were also promoting the idea of Western education. Now this idea meant that the education would be in English language. Moreover, it would be a co-education system. They believed in equal opportunities, and so it would be co-education system. The Indian people naturally disliked this idea because it wasn't in line with their cultural values. Lastly, this seems to be very surprising, that is the use of railways. When British started to have good control over the administration of India, we can't only say that they were doing only evil things to hurt the Indian people. There were some good developments as well. For example, the development of railway, the transport system in India, which did not exist before. Moreover, things like telegraph also were introduced during this time period. But this looks rather surprising. Why I have written a positive point over here leading to War of Independence 1857. Actually, the Indians viewed this development of railway in a negative way as well. Most of the Indians were not actually satisfied with this kind of transport. The Indians believed that this is something introduced by the British which could result in crashes and accidents as well. Moreover, there was a perception that these railways would be able to transport the weapons and the soldiers of EIC as well from one place to another. Lastly, we talk about the economic reasons behind the War of Independence 1857. Starting with the effect of Industrial Revolution. So what was this Industrial Revolution that we are talking about? Britain saw the development of industries. They went onwards from the agricultural age and progressed onto the industrial age. In that industrial age, the machines were being invented, and soon the work was being automated. Now during this time, India actually became the raw materials market for the British East India Company. They would take away all the cotton or the raw materials from here in India, get it back to England, manufacture it in their own industries, and then sell back those goods in their Indian markets. But where is the problem? The problem rose when the Indians started to buy those British goods. As I said, these goods were flooding the Indian markets. By this I mean that they had gained so much control that they had removed all the import duties as well because of their influence. And because of this, their goods were easily accessible throughout India. They were flooding all across India. What's the problem? The problem is that the Indians were starting to prefer the British made goods over their own made goods, hence damaging their own economy. So because of this, many local businessmen started to lose their jobs. Many businesses were closed because the local goods were not being sold. One of the competitive advantage of the British EIC was that they were manufacturing goods in bulk and everything was done by machines, so everything was being done in a fine quality and at a lower price as compared to the Indian goods. For example, the Indian cloth at that time used to take 6 months to manufacture. So it means that the competitive advantage was that the Indians would naturally not buy the Indian goods and actually buy the British goods, which were superior in quality and cheaper in price and were more accessible than the Indian goods. Another problem was fixed tax, or what we call as Lagan. Yes, there is a movie as well, Lagan, in which Amir Khan has starred. And what was that message in that movie, Lagan? The message was that the EIC had imposed so much taxes on the landlord, and landlord had imposed in turn the taxes on the peasants. Some amount of those taxes was taken by the landlord and some amount was then forwarded to the British East India Company. So what was this Lagan actually? Lagan means fixed tax. When the British East India Company decided to gain control over the administration, they imposed fixed tax on the lands and on the landlords. Whether you are gaining in production or not, whether you are dealing in profit or loss, you have to pay such and such amount of tax to the British East India Company. Now this was emburdening the Indians, especially the peasants, the poor class, because now they had to pay in a way double the tax. Initially they would only pay to the landlord, but now there is someone else superior than the landlord, and that is the East India Company's administration. So because of this burden, not only the peasants but also the landlords were against the East India Company. There were other such policies as well, which we call agrarian policies of the East India Company. By agrarian we mean related to land, and these policies included the documentary proof of land. The British would ask the landlords to show them the documentary proof of their holdings. In case the landlords were not able to provide those, their lands were confiscated by the EIC. Now where is the problem? The problem is that the British East India Company found a loophole in the Indian system that at that time not much documentary proofs were maintained. And finding this opportunity, the British were able to exploit the Indian landlords and were able to capture their lands as well. And because of these policies, the Indians got against the British East India Company in the War of Independence 1857. Thank you.